talk politics a little bit. Were you surprised George Bush was reelected in 2004?
Well, not really. It was, I mean, the election was kind of like flipping a coin.
Well, I was going to say, so Kerry didn't, in your view, am I right, and didn't present any really clear alternative?
In fact, the election is quite interesting. A very small percentage of the voters knew what the stands of the candidates were. It was around 10% were aware of the stands of the candidates. And some of them were hopelessly deluded. For example, a majority of Bush voters thought that he was in favor of the Kyoto protocols, because they were in favor of it. And it's that way across the board. And so the Kerry voters were slightly more aware of his policies, but not much. I mean, take say, one of the main domestic problems, health care. It's a huge problem. A considerable majority of the population, for a long time, have been in favor of some kind of national health care system. When it's ever even mentioned, at the last debate, October 28th, a couple of days before the election, was on domestic issues. The New York Times had an interesting article on it the next day. It pointed out that Kerry had never brought up any program on health care. It's the main domestic issue. And they gave the reason. They said there's so little political support for it, like only about three-quarters of the population. But that doesn't count as political support. Political support means the pharmaceutical corporations, the financial institutions, and so on. If we let that happen, it's our fault. We don't have to agree to that.
Do you think Iraq will ever be a sovereign, independent country?
It is almost inconceivable that the U.S. would allow Iraq to be sovereign in any meaningful sense, and there's a simple reason for it. If Iraq were to become sovereign and democratic, it has a Shiite majority. They would obviously dominate. They are right next door to Iran, Shiite Iran. They aren't madly in love with Iranians, but they'd rather have a friendly neighbor than a hostile one. Furthermore, the connections are very tight. The main militias that are largely running the South were trained in Iran. The religious leaders are mostly Iranian. There's a lot of interaction up and back. They're surely going to establish close relations with Iran. There's a Shiite population in Saudi Arabia right on the border. They have been brutally repressed by the U.S.-backed Saudi tyranny. Now they're beginning to be moves towards demands for some sort of rights and autonomy, spurred by what's happening next door.
So are we going to continue to occupy Iraq?
Well, just think what this would mean. The Shiite area of Saudi Arabia is where most of Saudi oil is. Iraq is the second largest oil center in the world. Iran is a substantial one. You can imagine if Iraq were to become sovereign, a loose alliance, Shiite alliance, independent of the United States, that would control most of the world's oil. Is the United States going to permit that?
Well, so you've said that one of the key reasons we went into Iraq is to control the oil. Now,
we wouldn't have invaded Iraq if it was producing pickles and lettuce. Well, everybody knows that.
But a cynic would say, if that's the case, why are we paying $3 a gallon for gasoline?
Actually, $3 a gallon is very cheap. It's way less than most of the world. And we should have higher gas prices to induce pressures for alternative fuels, because it's not going to last forever. But the U.S. does not control Saudi. The U.S. has tried to control, has intended and has succeeded in controlling the Middle East since the Second World War. But it isn't to keep gas prices low. It's to control the price level within a certain range. The U.S. doesn't want it to be too low, doesn't want it to be too high, and to use it as a lever of strategic power. I mean, that's explicit. So, for example, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, one of the more astute of the foreign policy class, this big name of Brzezinski, pointed out correctly that he was not particularly in favor of the war, but he said that controlling Iraq will give the United States what he called critical leverage over our major rivals, Europe and Asian economies. And that's true. If you have your hand on the spigot, you have strategic power. Now, that's way more important than what gas prices are for leadership.
We only have less than a minute. Is there anything right about this country?
Sure, there's a lot right about it, like what you and I are doing. I mean, in many respects, this is the most free country in the world. Like, for example, freedom of speech, which is just critical critical values protected in the United States more than anywhere in the world that I know of. And we can go on with a long list. These are not gifts. These are rights that have been won by struggle, and they got to be maintained by more struggle.
Professor Chomsky, it's a delight to have you here. I really appreciate your time. MIT's Noam Chomsky from September.